So we have plenty of talent to fill the afternoon. We also have quite a lot of time, so we've got time to explore a number of issues. We're going to do that in a range of ways. We're going to try and be a bit interactive as we go along in various ways. I'm just going to set the scene a little bit in terms of dream and the topic focus that we're going to return to. And I'm going to do this partly to give the early stage researchers a chance to think about some answers to some questions before he gets to me later on. Peter is going to take over and again set the scene from a different perspective. We'll be drawing you guys into a little impromptu interaction with the people in the room. We'll take a coffee break, and then we're going to come back to the more the chance for each of you to have your say and reflect. That's okay? Good. So Jerry asked me to chair this session, and when he did, I was pleased to do so. It reminded me of two things. One was doing my own PhD and putting myself back in the position that these guys have been in for 3 years. And those of you who were bored enough to read my PhD years ago, you might remember that it's concerned with markets. And it's really about what happens when you try to pursue a dream in a market, and what happens to that dream along the way. And the dream at that particular time was the independent living movement, and the vision of user-controlled personal assistance and personal budgets, and a group of people in the Centre for Independent Living, run by disabled people, trying to provide what they wanted to do within a new piece of legislation that meant that they had to sell that within a contracting and tendering service with the municipality. And there's quite a lot of theory about what happens to your dream if you try and operate it in a capitalist market. Sociologists have written about that. There's a tendency to a thing called institutional isomorphism, good word, which Weber describes as a tendency for institutions to become more and more like one another through the process of marketization. The providers, multiple providers of a product, it may start off as a diverse product, but through processes of marketization and the drive towards profit and the reduction of cost, that the product tends to become more and more similar or more and more conservative. And the other thing is a thing called mission distortion, which is that you start out with a dream, but it turns into a nightmare if you're not careful. So I remember those things from my own PhD, and it's quite interesting to hear how some of these projects have gone looking at the effect of market forces and market pressures and market relationships on the sorts of things that we dream about. But the other thing is Jerry said no slides. But what I remember was the first set of slides that we used on the first day of the first joint training session that we had in Leeds. So I dug them out. So I haven't made any new slides, but I'll just show you these. We used a slide called a paradoxical dream. So D-R-E-A-M, dream, was standing at the time for disability rights, expanding accessible markets. And this afternoon is really about that kind of market dimension of that, in a sense. Can we expand disability rights through making markets more accessible? And the reason it was paradoxical went something like this. So I'll just run through D-R-E-A-M. Disability, we talked from a disability studies perspective as a set of oppressive social relationships that exist between people with diverse capabilities. It is a set of social relations, if you like, rather than a set of medical impairments. But many of the authors who argued in disability studies, people like Mike Oliver, Finkelstein, other people, argued that those inequalities and oppression arose from a set of market relationships, from the emergence of modernity and capitalism, and competing in an unequal set of social relationships. That when people compete in a market, there are winners and losers. So there had been a long argument that disability itself arose out of the free market, that it was an unequal consequence of the free market. So we were very interested in rights. We spent a day talking about rights, the realisation of full participation on an equal level with others. We talked about accessibility. We spent a whole day talking about that. How would we create goods and services that were usable by everyone? And then we went back to markets, and we spent a day talking about markets. And the idea of the free market and whether markets can be free, can people participate equally and freely in markets and enter into equal contracts. But cyclically, when we get to that point, we come back to disability. So if it's the free market that in some sense has created certain inequalities and oppressions, can the free market solve those forms of inequality and oppression? And I know that some of the people here have been dealing with the producers of products and goods, the sellers of products and goods, and the consumers of products and goods, and their relationships. And I guess what we'll be really interested later in the afternoon, give you time to think, do we have any answers to that question? Can, you know, from your studies, does the free market have the opportunity to bring us more equality? Can we implement disability rights through the free market? And what extent do policies and regulations and design for all contribute or to that? What are the barriers? And I'm sure you've lots of reflections and research, but maybe towards the end of the afternoon we might come back to that bigger question. So that's just a primer for later on. And now for something completely different. Do you want to speak from there?
No, I'll come up there.
So,
Thank you.
Peter needs no introduction, really, and there's a potted biography.
That's what my wife said.
in the programme. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you on behalf of DREAM, and as one of our experienced researchers, and also to have the American perspective in the European project is just excellent.
As it is. Thank you. It really is an honor to be here and a pleasure to listen to people like Anita, who I haven't met before, and Gabor and others. I had prepared remarks, and I'm going to call on these guys with regard to the economics of disability and talking about this new book that I have coming out called Equality, which is about accessibility to the web and the economic implications of that. But I must say I was very taken with not only these guys, some of whom had visited me at Syracuse, and the panel this morning, to say a bit about, without putting the dreamers to sleep, or creating any nightmares, but about a little bit about how I came to disability. And I never had the luxury nor intended to enter into the disability field. And I never knew I was going to be in the disability field. Unlike Mark, who has written seminal works, and others in the room, I got my PhD as an experimental social psychologist. My thesis was on nonverbal communication in the clinical context, the doctor-patient relation, the student-teacher relationship. My mentor was a guy named Robert Rosenthal, who wrote a very famous book called Pygmalion in the Classroom. And he studied self-fulfilling prophecies. For a time, I thought I was going to go into clinical psychology because of my work in the doctor-patient relationship, particularly in the mental illness area, and particularly because lurking in the back of my mind, as we all know, family experiences of close family members who were experiencing mental illness, bipolar now, and other sorts of issues. But at the time, there was no sense of disability advocacy in me. Like, I forget who said it this morning. Was it Anna talking about growing up with disability? Well, I didn't have quite that same experience, but you don't realize it at the time. It just becomes the way you exist. So I got my PhD at Harvard, and then I taught in the business school, organizational behavior, and did a postdoc there. And then I got a call from a professor at Stanford Law School, a guy named David Rosenhan, who had read some of my earlier work on the doctor-patient relationship. And he had written a very interesting and important piece, I think it was in Science, called On Being Sane in Insane Places. And probably, Gabor, you're very familiar with that, and David just passed away, a really nice guy. And his, basically what he did was he took his dreamers, his PhD students, into a local psychiatric mental hospital, mental institute. And he didn't say anything about them, and he just told them, take notes in a Goffman kind of way about the experience. And lo and behold, of course, they were acting just perfectly like, you know, PhD students, I guess. And very quickly they were labeled by the psychiatric staff as paranoid schizophrenics who were constantly taking down notes. And of course, all the patients in the institution, institution at the time, knew that they were not patients in the sense that they were, and they thought they were being studied. And David wrote this very well-cited study called On Being Sane in Insane Places. And it, of course, the message was that it was the institutional constraints, it was the whole social milieu that set up a prophecy of not well-being, a prophecy of insanity, a prophecy of mental illness, which of course wasn't the case. As a result of that experience, and then going to Stanford to law school, and then clerking with a very loud and a very forceful young lawyer at the United States Court of Appeals named Elena Kagan, who now sits on our United States Supreme Court, I decided to practice law at this big old stuffy law firm in Washington, D.C. And the first thing they did was, because I had a PhD in psychology, they said, well, why don't you go up to the Hill? This was 1990. Why don't you go up to Capitol Hill and find out what this thing is going on called the Americans with Disabilities Act? And like in any law firm, the lawyers know, or anybody else, quickly you become the expert because nobody else wants to spend time doing it. And spent a lot of time working on, with people like Justin Dart and others some of you may have known or heard about, on the birth of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I did not write it, although there are about 1,000 people who said they wrote it. I did not write it. I was not involved with with actually the advocacy side at that time, because I was representing clients like John Deere and big companies that my firm represented who wanted to understand more about the implications of this law for the employment side. But what struck me, and this is relevant to our conversation today, was Justin Dart, who was kind of the grandfather of the disability rights movement in the United States. I don't know, Gabor or others, if you've come to the point for the CRPD where you have the grandfather and the other sort, maybe you are him or her, other folks. Justin Dart came from a very wealthy family. He was an advisor at the time to President Reagan, and subsequently I worked for President Clinton, and so did he on ADA issues. And Justin's family, Justin used a wheelchair, and his family owned the Dart Drugstore Company, which was now like CVS or something if you've been in the United States. Very wealthy guy, but was totally focused and committed to passage of the ADA and the disability rights agenda. And he would always say, which now sounds kind of, oh yeah, of course, that at that time he would say, civil rights and economics are two sides of the same coin. That is, you really can't have one without the other in his mind. Economic empowerment, asset development, which we all study now, were central to his idea of full and equal rights of citizenship, active citizenship, as our colleagues Runa and Bjorn would say from Norway. And so, very quickly, I got involved with the ADA, and before I knew it, I was in an institution in the middle of Oklahoma, representing the state, in the middle of the night, walking around an institution. It was a deinstitutionalization case, and talking with the staff about, I'll never forget, they referred to these adults in cribs, which were essentially cages, all the way up bars, as their babies. And they were talking about how they were getting the best of care. They had, it sounds almost, I don't know what to make of it today. They had the car wash, which they lost with the Department of Justice on, of course, which was they bathed the individuals by lining them up in their wheelchairs with no clothes on and running them through and spraying them with the high power hose. So this was 1990 that was going on in the United States. Scenes that you never forget in your mind, and scenes, interestingly, which were not seen, I'm not making a moral judgment on the folks who were there at the time, but were not seen as out of the ordinary. It was the way things were done, even as late as 1990. As a result of that, again, I don't want to belabor too much about my own past, but the question I'm going to ask you guys is, what can we learn from history? And as we come on the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act next year, where are you going to be at the 25th anniversary of the CRPD in 2033. What are you going to be doing? The 50th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act is in 2040. I'll be in my 80s. I don't know what I'll be doing, but I'm going to be interested in what you guys are doing. So, to make my long story short, which is relevant to our conversation today, of course, I got very involved in the ADA, was fortunate to be with great collaborators, a lot like this consortium, very early empirical research on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And here's another interesting point which I will throw out to you again for your comment. Hopefully you'll learn from our old timers about our mistakes. When I was doing some very early empirical research on the Americans with Disabilities Act, on the costs of workplace accommodations. Remember, I was trained as an experimental social psychologist. I had come up with some numbers, cost effectiveness, now we take it for granted. And for those of you that knew the American disability scene, there was we called her the general. Her name was Pat Wright. And she was kind of a real fire breather who marched the legislation through the Congress. And by the way, by 1992, I was in Iowa working with Tom Harkin, who you saw on the screen not too earlier. I was at the University of Iowa. And I'll never forget, this is relevant to you guys too, we're talking about research and action, and the comment that we heard earlier back today, she said, don't bother us with your empirical evidence-based research. This is a civil rights law. This is the right thing to do, and your research is great, but we don't need help from the academic setting. Real fire breather, great respect for her. I'm overstating it a little bit, but the point she was making was, regardless of your academic studies, this is the right thing to do. This is a civil right that we're going to protect. Footnote, 25 years later, when I was doing work with the first George Bush, in an ancillary kind of way, they couldn't get enough of evidence-based data. Everything they wanted to do for law was evidence-based data. Show me the evidence-based support for the policy that you want us to work on. So I did some very early empirical research and was fortunate to act in one of the first cases under the Americans with Disabilities Act in the employment setting. And I want to ask you if this is true today. I'm peppering you with all these softballs that you're going to come back and. So now it's a fairly well-known case. The client was a guy named Don Perkel, and I've told some of you about this. He had, at the time it was called mental retardation, now it's called intellectual disability. And he was working quite effectively in Madison, Wisconsin, in a Chuck E. Cheese pizza parlor, which can only be an American invention. Chuck E. Cheese pizza parlor is like the Disney of pizza. You go there, well, you never want to go there, first of all, unless you have little kids or you're a grandparent. But you go there, and there's a mouse show and a stage and all these games and kids running around like crazy and jumping into these big things of plastic balls and stuff. And Don was working there and was beloved in Madison, Wisconsin, an otherwise very liberal town. And the general manager came up from Texas of Chuck E. Cheese and saw Don, who was working there, who was beloved by the staff. Here comes your next question for culture, corporate culture and so forth. And the manager said to the staff, I don't like the way that guy looks, fire him. And here's another question coming. In terms of humanity and in terms of advocacy, the staff basically said, if you fire him, we're all quitting. And the genius from Texas, no allusion to some of our presidents of the past, fired Don. And the EEOC and others retained me, and I was actually acting for the court to explain concepts of stigma, to explain concepts of why it was important that Don not go back to a sheltered workshop where he had worked his whole life. And now he was working in this pizza parlor. He was doing janitorial work, and he was also doing pizza preparation. Not a stitch of anything wrong with his work. Everybody loved him. And so long story short, God knows why they went to trial. And I was talking to a jury, like right here. And in 3 days, the jury came back and said, yeah, discrimination, $90,000 in back pay, and end of the case. So we were all happy and about to leave, a little bit like one of those times you'll remember in your life when you start working, or maybe you have already in these areas, kind of like a 12 Angry Men, if you've ever seen that movie. case, the jury foreperson, who was a man, who actually was on crutches, stood up and said, "Your Honor, we'd like to ask you if we can say something else." And he said yes. And he said, "Your Honor, so that this type of discrimination," this was in 1992, "never happens again in our little city, may we award Don Perkle $13 million in punitive damages to send a message." And the judge said, "You may." It wasn't quite the end of the story. The defense counsel came back with a straight face. This is all on the record. Here's another question coming up. And they said, "How could this man with intellectual disabilities enjoy the fruits of $13 million? He wouldn't know this is a serious, lawyers get paid to make these sorts of motions. How could he enjoy the fruits of that $13 million? And of course, we came back and said, he'll enjoy every penny of that $13 million. And the judge upheld the verdict, which still may be the largest verdict of its kind in this type of case. And from that point on, when you have a life experience like that, and again, I'm just one among many in the States who do this sort of stuff, but I became, and I'd be interested in some of the comments that were made earlier, I changed from a more traditional academic to a more activist, entrepreneurial academic. Now, footnote, again, part of that was because I thereafter was above the bar. I had received tenure, which we call in the United States. So pre and post tenure, I know we're being videotaped, but you write a little bit different things. You write things that you want to be recognized in your community. Post tenure, you have a job for life in the United States, and you have a little more freedom to perhaps do what you want to do, write what you want to write. And I testified before Congress. I acted in a case against Target Corporation pro bono as a counsel, taking them on because they did not want to have their website accessible to users who were blind. Questions coming to those of you that are doing accessible technology. Robert, you're doing this at TechnoSite. Do you remember the Target case?
Yes, sir.
So we did that. Target is like Carrefour or Costco, huge store. Lord knows why. They didn't want more customers. They didn't want to take money from blind people, and people who were blind could not use their website. So we won that case. And Target ended up giving $7 million into what's called a Cypre fund, a charity fund, so that this would never happen again. I don't win all the cases, I'm just telling you the ones I win. So we can talk afterwards about all the ones that were hard fought and not won. That led to, here's another, this is for Anthony. That led to the CNN case, which you know about. I was acting, I'm still acting, because this is a case like, you know the book Bleak House? Dickens, where the litigation goes on for a generation, basically. I'm acting for, again, pro bono, the Greater Los Angeles Association of the Deaf. So went from blind to deaf. CNN, in its great wisdom, don't ask me why, decided not to caption their website clips. So if you go on to CNN or ESPN or whatever the BBC News, they probably do it. They have like those news clips, the shorter pieces. CNN decided not to caption. Mostly because what's interesting in the United States is they're probably going to do it anyway, like Target did, corporate culture question. But they didn't want to be told by the regulators and the federal court that they had to do it. It's almost like a parent-child sort of thing. So CNN, which is very interesting, question also Robert and others are coming more questions too. CNN defended its case for not captioning the web on the grounds that, not that it would infringe upon our clients' speech rights to participate in the community, but by captioning it, it would force them to limit their speech rights, their free speech rights. In other words, they are acting in a way that they otherwise would choose not to act, as bizarre as it sounds. And this is not inconsistent, by the way, with a whole argument that Abby didn't have a chance to talk about. Where's Abby? Abby's back there. In the United States, even in light of the Marrakesh Treaty, there are terrific battles between intellectual property and the extent to which content on the web must be made accessible for people with disabilities. My new book, called Equality, the little plug for the book, which is coming out this summer by Cambridge, is about these cases and Marrakesh and all this other stuff, but I'm focused on the next generation that this is going to be applied to. Question for the group, maybe Robert or others, and that is people with cognitive disabilities, who are in fact among the most stigmatized, the most institutionalized, the poorest in society. People, not only, as Abby said, with print disabilities, but I interpret in my lawyerly way print disability, having talked with George and others, George Kirscher, to include cognitive disability, learning disability, autism, any form of alternative way of reading and so forth, which, by the way, from a universal design perspective makes sense, because you get into cross-lingual applications and you get into a whole range of cross-cultural applications and so forth. That's probably a question for one of these guys over here. And I'm going to finish up in a little bit and then we're going to engage, so be ready, guys. Last summer, and I referred to this, the Jenny Hatch case, which I think will become a seminal case if it hasn't already. I was very fortunate to act in that case for a woman named Jenny Hatch, who I mentioned. Jenny Hatch has intellectual disability, is 29. Long story short, she wanted to have a say in where she lived, what cell phone she used, who she saw, where she worked, basically everything that all of us in this room would want. For whatever reason, the court was in a little courthouse in Hampton Roads, Virginia, in a little faraway place in the United States. Her parents contested that and wanted plenary guardianship over her. By the way, I'm not making any statements about the morality or the rightness or wrongness of her parents. They had their own views, very traditional views, and this was not really about parents versus Jenny. What it was about was the first time in the United States that we had pled that supported decision-making, as we know it in the United States, should be recognized by a court of law as a course for Jenny. Never happened before. Well, it happened in this case last summer. For the first time, a United States court said, not only was this guardianship not going to be allowed, but Jenny had a right, in law, to have the kind of supports that she requested to make the sorts of decisions she wanted. I know we talked a lot about supported decision-making this morning. As a result of that case, we at the Burton Blatt Institute received a rather large grant and formed the Jenny Hatch Justice Foundation, the project, Jenny Hatch Justice Project. And I'm telling you that because you can go to the website and you can see all this information talking about putting academics into practice, about blogs with consumers, research information. We're starting to do a 50-state review of laws with regard to guardianship. We are starting to write model laws, which is maybe something you do in Europe, model laws and model statutes for individuals to raise in their own states to support supported decision-making. One of our colleagues is a guy named Ari Neiman. Some of you may know. He's head of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And he is on, we do webcasts, webinars, whatever they're called. He just did one for us, and he said his view is just like institutions, in his lifetime he hopes to see an end of the term guardianship as it's presently used in the United States. I don't know if there are similar movements in Europe or elsewhere. So now we're coming up on the Americans with Disabilities Act at 25. And my original remarks were focused on what I was supposed to talk about. That is marketplace demands and economic empowerment. And so I will end with that, and then we'll engage in a conversation. And I'll tell you my take on that. Probably 3 words in terms of economic empowerment for individuals with disabilities. And they are participatory, mobile, and cloud, or participatory web 2.0. So we all know that you can hardly not exist in this world today without having meaningful access to the web and all that it offers. Interestingly, by the way, Tim Berners-Lee published his first report on the web, proposing the web in 1990, a couple of months before George Bush, the first president, was signing the ADA into law. And In some ways, it's a coincidence, but it's a very interesting coincidence, because both were meant to, in Tim Berners-Lee's mind, break down barriers and enhance participation, active participation in society. We are now at a point where the web, as you guys know, and this goes to the employment stuff as well, corporate culture, is so interactive from a consumer point of view, from a shopping point of view. I forget which one of you is working on retail and shopping, and maybe you've explored the web as a component of that as well. In addition to physical stores, they're so linked now these days. But the web is moving so quickly, and everything is mobile, and more is in the cloud, the so-called off-site computing. What I'm writing about now and trying to understand, I'm going to learn from you guys, is the implications of this evolving web, not just is the wrong word, for individuals with sensory impairments, but individuals with cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, autism. Because the real economic power, so I say, in the future is going to be web content. There's a very famous Harvard law professor named Larry Lessig, many of you know, who said that something like computer code is law. That's what he's famous for. In other words, how the computer code is set up greatly defines the regulatory approach, greatly defines, open source, closed source, access to the web. Well, for me, content is power. And most people, not in any way minimizing any other functional limitation or impairment, whatever it is, but by far, based on my stats, and I could be wrong, the largest subgroup of individuals with disabilities in this world are people with cognitive disabilities. Intellectual, autism, learning, so forth. Traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, mental health conditions. I put those all in that definition. Some may disagree, but cognitive mental disabilities. And increasingly, the web underclass includes those individuals because the web is neither understandable nor accessible. In other words, usable or accessible. From an economic point of view, the whole future business model of these companies, from Google on down, and Amazon, is to attract as many buyers and products and advertisers as they can. And one thing you guys will be studying is, how is it possible, talking about marketplace power, that a company like Amazon, which has been sued for the Kindle many times because it's not capable of use with much screen reader technology, would want to exclude from a business point of view tens of thousands of people who are potential paying customers? Why would CNN not want to expose 100,000 of our clients in California who are deaf to the advertising they're selling on CNN.com? What does it say about the market? Here's the question to you guys. What does it say about that market failure and attitudes about disability? Why should that market failure exist? What would that market failure look like if CNN said, we don't want any African Americans using our website, or we don't want any Hispanics using our website? Besides the firestorm that would erupt. From purely an economic market point of view, what executive would keep his or her job if he or she said that? Now, the last couple of points I will make, and this goes to Rosemary's always excellent point. Rosemary just woke up from a nice dream. No, I'm teasing you, Rosemary. The amazing thing about the web, and Rosemary, you can tell me I'm all wet on this, is that it's the best merger, and this was talked about earlier today, of substantive equality and of personalization or accommodation at the same time. So in the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's anchored basically in two concepts: anti-discrimination, that is not being treated different, and accommodation, that is being treated individually. Well, that's what the web can do. One size fits one on the web. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, I have another, as Gerard would say, another punishment. I'm president now of a new nonprofit called Raising the Floor, the US version, which is organized by a guy named Greg Vanderheiden. If you don't know him, some of you should know him. He's an amazing technologist focusing on world-class accessibility. He has a number of projects in the EU. I think one is called Cloud for All, and you probably work on that, Robert.
Yes, sir.
And many other projects. The one we're working on is called the GPII, the Global Public, what is it, Inclusive Infrastructure, Robert?
I don't know,
GPII. Essentially, what we are doing at Raising the Floor is trying to make the web accessible to everybody, regardless of disability, economic status, literacy, and the way we're doing it, it's really fascinating. He's gotten quite a bit of money from the EU, and now we're just starting in the United States. And Raising the Floor is kind of the consortium that houses a lot of these projects, Cloud for All, and I am managing the US Raising the Floor. Greg is head of the international group, which is based in Geneva, I think. And what he's basically doing is creating, for lack of a better word, this is your question, wizards in the sky, so that any individual should be able to sit down at any device, and that device can be customizable for use by that person in terms of language usability, language complexity, basic language, the way it's read, and a whole host of other personalized accommodations. That's why I said one size fits one. The last point I would make, and not singling anybody out, but this is for my friend Anthony on the end, is of course everything we're doing in the web, and I don't have time to go into it, read the book, bumps into personal privacy, security, it bumps into, of course, intellectual property. So there was a and Abby's the expert on this, there was an extraordinarily important case, legal case in the United States this past year, which you should be aware of, called the Hathai Trust, the Authors Guild, the Hathai Trust. In a nutshell, basically, the authors argued that it violated this Authors Guild argued that it violated copyright law if their materials, without their permission, were going to be presented in an accessible format. Try to wrap your head around that. In other words, a screen reader format in an ebook for people who are blind. That's what they argued. Thank goodness, the United States Court of Appeals just a couple weeks ago, right, Abby? Last Monday, just reaffirmed that in fact it was a principle of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it did not violate copyright law, that a transformative use, a transformation of this intellectual property into an accessible form did not violate the owner's copyright interests, which is an extraordinarily important finding in the United States, and of course quite consistent with the Marrakesh Treaty, which was to aim to avoid this so-called book famine, because many countries, individuals who were blind, for example, did not have access to ebooks because they were not accessible in that particular country. And by the way, everything about this is relevant to cognitive disability as well, which is the mother of all. It includes hearing, sensory. The accommodations for cognitive disability include all those accommodations as well. So the question I would leave to you with that little autobiographical nightmare to the dreamers, that and hopefully I didn't catch you napping, I'm using all the dream metaphors. The question I have to you is, that's a little bit about where I came from, probably more than you needed to hear. My basic premise is that, for example, in the web, a separate world is not an equal world. And this is not new. This is Brown versus the Board of Education. A separate web, a separate entrance, a separate anything is not equal if the person chooses to engage in that way, as anybody else would do. Some of my colleagues disagree with me, by the way. There's some very well-known scholars in the United States, law professors, Ruth Coker, for example, who I have great respect for, who believes that sometimes separate is appropriate. I don't take her on a case-by-case basis, but my general presumption is separate is not equal. And that's what I've argued in all these cases. And what I'm interested from you guys is understanding, and we can go down the line or have her start with Anthony. You can pick any, if that's okay, Mark. do it that way. Pick any question you want or any topic I've raised, including debunking or saying I'm all wet on anything. And we'll start with Anthony, I guess. Yes.
We need to swap microphones.
We need to swap microphone. Oh, he has a microphone.
Do we have a microphone?
Oh, we do.
Yes, do.
Okay, that works.
You have all of you have a terrific and long career ahead of you. And now I'm sounding a little parental, but please excuse it. I have 4 children. You guys don't know how lucky you are to have the mentors that you have in this room, from Gerard on down. You have an extraordinary platform, which comes with an extraordinary responsibility to follow through in your countries and around the world, because you're going to be leaders of this is the first class of dreamers, is that right? Okay, so you have a responsibility, and I'm saying that really with some degree of seriousness, to now go out and multiply, but also multiply academically, I mean, and to take what we have tried to convey to you. Mark, has been path-breaking. Gerard, so many others, Nora in the room, Jerome, and I'm leaving out people, our friends from Iceland. You have a lot of collected wisdom here, and I think you can do better than we did. A lot of us, and I don't know if I can speak for everybody, but a lot of us just woke up one day and we were working in this field. And it was due to a number of different circumstances. And so, first of all, I congratulate all of you. And secondly, I think all of us would be very interested to hear your reflections about some of the things I've talked about, if that's appropriate, and also to be a little on target of what this was supposed to be about, the market implications. Is that what it was supposed to be about, this session? The market forces and the future market implications in the disability arena as well. And I will, if with Mark's permission, I'll stand here, and if I disagree with something, I'll, in a law professor mode, take you on.
Great.
Thank you.
Anthony, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Peter. My name is Anthony. I work at Nova in Oslo, Norway, and my specialty area is web accessibility. So everything that you've just discussed it resonates with me, and obviously the amount of notes that I've taken was going to take a long time to discuss. But I'll pick a couple of things, in particular these market forces. I do think there are a lot of economic incentives out there for businesses to not be accessible. And one of the useful approaches has been to try to harness those in ways that can incentivize voluntary compliance. And I think that avoids some of the intransigence you get from more of a litigatory approach. As you said, the Target case and others have a lot of the reasons why businesses have maybe resisted taking accessibility on has been because of the desire not to be regulated. And from, I guess, an economic standpoint or a business standpoint or an entrenched interest standpoint, that does make sense. On the other hand, these are rights, these are obligations, and so I think that we have to find as many ways as possible pursuing those. In terms of market failure and kind of attitudes, you mentioned that it would be a business would be very hesitant to say, well, we don't allow people of other ethnicities or races or nationalities to purchase our services, and yet I seem to remember that in the civil rights movement there was businesses that were kind of, well, we don't make products for those people, and I don't think that's the attitude in business towards disability. I don't think businesses are, a lot of them outwardly, in terms of web accessibility, let me narrow down a little bit. I don't think they're outwardly discriminatory. What I think it is a lot of indirect discrimination policies that they have in place that kind of prevent them from achieving accessibility. And I don't know how, well, I have some ideas of how to remediate that, but...
well, let me ask you one last question, then we can go down the line. What did your PhD research, your topic, illuminate with regard to what you're talking about?
So a lot of web accessibility has come down, or web accessibility policy has come down to performance standards. So the standards that Greg Werner-Heiden has developed, and these have been incredibly useful for kind of establishing a baseline of what an accessible website is or could or should be. There are obviously deficiencies, as there always will be when it comes to kind of performance outcomes. or trying to define performance outcomes for such a broad base of abilities. But there's a lot of opportunity for looking at more of an organizational aspect and trying to encourage accessible processes. So instead of mandating, or instead of trying to focus on accessible outcomes in terms of the performance, focusing more on the process of achieving accessible outcomes. So developing accessibility statements and user testing and things like that. That to me is a really promising area of continued work.
Excellent. Is it Eva who's next?
Yeah.
Eva, you're working on retail and shopping accessibility?
Yes, I am.
Is that right? And it's just by way of background, in the United States, there isn't a day that goes by still where there's not litigation brought with regard to physical accessibility to the world of retail. So your topic is very timely.
And actually, going back to your and Mark's questions, what I found really very interesting was your example about the Amazon and about producing, choosing to produce or not to produce accessible products. And what was interesting in my research was that industry is interested in accessibility. However, not like I wouldn't say that it is more an exception than a rule. Like there is that common understanding that yes, accessibility is good, and yes, this is a new area and a new sector, a new part of our customers. But there are many tensions and many processes happening within the industry, happening within industry and policymakers, between industry policymakers and civil society. And I think one of the, I could discuss this forever, but one of the things is that the discourse is so different, and that
within the EU itself?
Within different stakeholders.
Yeah.
For instance, starting by the fact that accessibility of industry, the understanding of accessibility that has industry and disabled people organizations is not completely different, but it is different. Because DPOs and civil society looks to accessibility as a human right from human right perspective, and industry looks from minimal requirements and minimal guidance and meeting these requirements. And when these people come to the one room and they have policymakers, the discourse is so different, power relations are very different. Sometimes it's really very difficult to, find what we're actually doing, what we want to do, what it is accessibility, to which groups we are looking at.
What's your view of whether or not it will be possible to harmonize these attitudes across the EU?
That's a good question. Well, I think, going back to my internship, because I had a possibility and opportunity to spend 3 months with EDF and 3 months with Digital Europe. So I had a possibility to observe what is happening and what is the position within civil society and then within business representatives. And I am quite optimistic because things are happening and people industry has that interest in accessibility and has good intentions. But what I find really very important is that within the company, accessibility is more present in those companies which have 1 or 2 people who are interested in accessibility and who are the engine promoting accessibility agenda within the company. Because when it comes to decision-making process, which feature should be included, although you have that very good dialogue between designers and users, when it comes to cost-benefit analysis or to marketing and to all these big structures within the company, it's it just those patterns dim and they disappear. They don't disappear, but they become slower and slower. The process of accessibility implementation and introducing accessible features, it becomes really very slow. So I think things are happening, but at the same time there are different barriers in market and society and politics that prevent from achieving what we could actually achieve.
Great, thank you. Yulia, so you're studying corporate culture?
Yes, I'm studying corporate culture.
A lot of which is attitudes, underlying attitudes. So what's the view of the world from that perspective?
Yeah.
Eva was saying you have one or two leaders in a company, but it takes more than that to change a culture of a large organization.
Yes, that's. I want to answer your question with my perspective about what can we learn from history, and we can learn that the change is happening. And on the one hand, we can see that the change is happening in the policy environment, and at the same time, when we look at the enterprises, and especially the large enterprises, we see from like being external observers that the change is also happening, and we see that companies more and more demonstrate that they are becoming inclusive, that they are becoming accessible, that they are non-discriminative, and they promote equality of opportunities. But and the best cases are also multiplying internationally. But when it comes to real practices and real daily activities of the enterprises, it's very difficult to get inside, and it's very difficult to understand what is really happening.
That's what you learned from your dissertation?
Yes. It's also, I think it is always the confrontation between the efficiency and between the responsibility to some extent, when companies show good examples and demonstrate that they are non-discriminative and they promote equality. They want to show that they are responsive for the communities and that they follow the legislation. But at the same time, it's kind of what needs to happen, it needs to that individuals, active individuals inside the companies, they need to promote the corporate culture, and as you said, it needs not only be the values and not only be the norms promoting non-discrimination and equality, it also needs to be the this also need to be the attitudes and the behaviors of people inside the organizations, and it needs to be the whole corporate culture, inclusive corporate culture.
Are you optimistic that things are changing?
It is. I mean, there are. I cannot say in about all the organizations, about all the countries, because my research is precisely focused on Norway, and I will probably say more about it later, about these particular examples. But yes, the change is happening, but it's slow. It's a slow process, and it depends a lot on the local environment, what I say, because on the global level, especially multinational enterprises, they might demonstrate the global policies and the great responsibilities, great examples, but because local environments are different, and they might have different legislation, different requirements, and to employers, and they tend to follow more the local policies and then say the global policies. But again, it differs.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good, thanks very much. So that's 3 out of 5. We're doing very well on timing. We plan to break for tea at, I believe, 3:15, so we're bang on schedule at the moment. Listening to Anthony and Diego and Julia, I just think it's fantastic how much you've grown in confidence since the first time we met in Brussels. Fantastic. But also a theme that's coming through is we're starting to get to what Jerry was talking about this more solution-focused approach. You know, what are the mechanisms? What are the incentives to voluntary action, or the requirements, or the mechanisms of change that are going to make these markets more accessible? Is it sticks? Is it carrots? And you're starting to come up with, you know, more specifics, and perhaps we'll think about those later after we've had tea as well.
That's an excellent point.
So,
Robert.
yes,
Robert, and I have a hard question for you to start.
Okay. Thanks.
I always ask Gerard this. And I'm not a CRPD specialist. Under the CRPD, is access to information and technology on the web a human right, or is it an enabler of other rights? Or does that question even matter for your purposes?
It does fall under Article 9. Can you guys hear me? I can't hear that well, so just want to double check. It is under Article 9 under accessibility. However, whether it's a human right or a enabler, I'm not an expert to go into the semantics between the two of those.
Mhm.
It is definitely there. Web and access to information. Well, access to information is specifically mentioned, so web is included in that by
So,
nature.
That was a tough question, so here's,
Yeah, sorry.
10 years from now, what are you going to be working on, do you hope, or if you imagine, or you happen to be dreaming,
Uh-huh.
or daydreaming?
Yeah, yeah.
No reaction to that pun, I guess. What would you be working on or thinking about that would be cutting edge beyond web accessibility that you're currently working on? Where's the field going? For me, it's web content, it's understanding.
I totally understand web content, and I'm sure that you agree that as well. When it comes to people creating websites, it needs to be accessible from the very beginning. And if you have a content management system like Drupal or Typo3, and the content is accessible, that's great. But the person managing the website also needs to understand accessibility as well. So if they upload a PDF and that PDF is not accessible, they're like, oh, it should be, but it's not. There needs to be captionings on the YouTube videos. There needs to be information in other formats for people with reading impairments, and also maybe simple English, diagrams, depending on the type of website and the nature of your organization, whether it's public or private. I definitely think that in the future I will be working in web, but hopefully as a manager, and hopefully my goal is to take my previous time working in the United Nations, taking at my disability time here, and then bringing it to a major international organization, working in either international development, working in IT, working in other fields, and making sure that people with disabilities in low-income countries are having their needs met and included in society. Whether it's through ICT for D, that's great. And if not, who knows what can happen in 10 years. We are supposed to be working ourselves out of a job, and I don't think that'll change in 10 years, but hopefully in another generation or two, this won't be an issue anymore.
Yeah.
It'll just be from the get-go.
We're coming also into new questions of privacy and security, which will perversely be related, because we're about to enter a whole new wave of ambient technologies, wearable technologies, digestible technologies. If you listen to the National Public Radio in the United States last week, they are now working on a pill that you digest that has a computer in it, imagine the size of it, which regulates blood flow, which regulates whether or not you need more medicine, and which communicates with your iPhone. So we're entering into this amazing age where biology is going to converge with web technology and situational awareness to help with wayfinding, to help with a whole range of things that we never thought of. And of course, the lawyers and the others would say, okay, that's great, but now are we entering an Orwellian world where, you are always known where you are. You always know what your blood pressure is and so forth. Have you come across any of that sort of stuff in your studies, this kind of next generation of situationally, biologically related web information?
I've read some studies on helping people with Alzheimer's communicate with loved ones via technology. Other than that, finding out, using applications on their phone to make sure that they are where they are, and yet that goes into privacy again.
Like self-driving cars.
Yeah.
In your lifetime, you may not be driving anymore by yourself.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
Well, I don't know
I would
about your
love that.
driving record. Mine's pretty good.
I don't know how to drive. I'm 29 and I don't know how to drive. So I would be the first in line to get a...
So what are you working on in your dissertation?
Right now I'm building the business case of e-accessibility. When it comes to e-accessibility, I'm focusing on web accessibility, and
What's the business case mean? What is
business case means the economic justification for a company to choose web accessibility when they don't really necessarily need to. Now, if it's a public website, such as from a government, for the citizens to get tax information, or for the citizens to register to vote, okay, those under ADA and under the vast majority of European legislation, those have to be accessible. There's no argument there. So I talk about that, and I have to talk about as well private websites. Target is a great case in the United States. However, I don't really talk about that in my dissertation. I'm focusing mostly in Europe. But I did read about Target, and even though they are a private organization, it's great that they were forced to make their technology more accessible to people using screen readers. So I think that's a great step in the right direction. There are many other cases, as you said as well, such as Amazon, but not just the Kindle, also their website. Netflix case as well, that's a big one as well. CNN, as you said. So the United States is great when it comes to people demanding rights for accessible technology. In my opinion, I think it's great.
Going back to the marketplace, by the way, you know where the most people find jobs are these days. Where's the most people find jobs?
Websites.
On the web. Monster.com just entered into, which is a big job finding website, just entered into a big consent decree to make their website accessible. They should have done it. Why? They sell their information to tons of other companies. That's how they make money. And if they're excluding a whole group of people from their website, well, they're undercutting their business model. Talking about a business case.
Absolutely, yeah. So there are a lot of different ways why a large company would think to themselves, oh, we want to include everybody, and the initial investment to make our non-accessible website accessible, we can evaluate that and then look at all the potential earnings that they can gain in the long run by making their website accessible, making their content accessible. So it's that initial investment, and then also the maintenance as well, which is a yearly cost, and then which is depending on the organization and depending on its purpose, it's relatively minimal.
Mm-hmm.
However, not everyone's an Amazon, not everyone's a Netflix, not everyone can afford these type of resources. Not everybody can get accessibility ninjas to make their website accessible.
And as Anthony could tell you, there was a case in Norway where a young kid started a business. He was crowdsourced captioning movies. And not only did he get slapped down and fined by the court, but they shut him down for violating copyright.
Ouch.
So there are a lot of landmines out there. Let's go to Beto, the last one. And you're studying employment trends generally across the European Union?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
several of the things I talked about relate to that, or you can pick up on anything else that was said as
Okay.
well.
I think I will start with the question where I am going to be in 10 years.
You're a prophet.
I can assure you that I will be a retiree with living with a cat.
10 years?
In 10 years. Actually, in 2 years, I'm going to have my retirement in Turkey.
Wow.
Yeah. But
Very good career you've had.
I definitely will be an actively involved social entrepreneur who generates as much as information as much as possible.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, my study do not address the
Tell us
accessibility, but I can.
Tell us about your
yeah.
dissertation, because the employment is the other theme that's going
It's a
on.
market.
I can-
Selling
I-
labour
I-
in a market.
yeah,
Labor
yes.
and
I
marketplace.
can still reflect on the experiences that I personally have, and also the experiences that the interviewees that I have privileged to meet during my research.
Great.
At some point, web can create employment opportunities for people with, especially with autism and Asperger's syndrome, who has incredibly good abilities to play with the data. But on the other hand, it may let out some people, especially people with sensory impairment and also people with intellectual disabilities. For example, one of my interviewees who has vision problems told me that when she applied a job through internet,
Mm-hmm.
she had been asked to go to the interview, and when she went to the interview, when she just been asked how she managed to come to the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are also lots of stigmas attached to the disabled public.
Hiring and job retention are two huge areas. There was just a case in the United States. Don't ask me what these big companies are thinking. ITT, a huge company. He got a person who was blind, got asked to take an interview, and then you have to take some sort of online test, and you have to complete it in 8 minutes. Don't ask me why. His screen reader couldn't keep up with that 8 minutes. He asked for a 12-minute accommodation. They said no, because if you can't do this in 8 minutes, how are you going to do work at our company? Well, you might be able to do work at their company just fine. Litigation. Recent litigation against the Customs and Border Patrol in the United States. Another person who was blind, who did administrative work, wanted to work at home 1 day a week like everybody else. No, because the security system was not accessible to code in off-site. Couldn't do his job, was fired, and brought a claim. These are the kinds of claims in employment that are really impacting the mobile society workers. Are you seeing any of that?
Actually, during my presentation, you are going to hear a lot
Excellent.
of
Excellent.
a lot of
I
things
didn't know
about
that.
it. But I forgot it. But and the another point that I would like to raise is that actually sometimes the web itself become inaccessible, especially if repeatedly keeps asking the passwords or changing the
Yes.
passwords.
Exactly.
And also, as a person who has working memory problems, I put the same password to every web page that I get online, and it's also putting me into a danger,
Yes. And
especially for the banking.
I would ask our CRPD experts, but wasn't the first case brought under the CRPD against a Hungary bank? Not a Hungry bank, that one.
Hungarian.
But a bank in Hungary?
That was the second case.
That was the second case. And it was resolved favorably, right?
Yes.
So we should give Mark the last words, because he's very brilliant at summarizing what we've heard, and then Mark, you can let us take a break.
Not even going to dream of summarising all of those points, but I think just to point us forward, say we'll break, have tea. We're going to come back. We have at our disposal. There's no law that says we have to finish at 5 o'clock, but I think we have enough talent here to keep us going for quite a while. But certainly coming back to those issues, small and medium-sized enterprises, private companies, these small website designers, the big Googles, the big Amazons, are there different drivers, different behavioural drivers? Do we need, as I say, carrots or sticks? Is it legislation and regulation that will make us hire disabled people? Or is it what did you say? Incentives to voluntary action? Is it hearts and minds? Within corporate culture, what are the drivers for
Can
change?
I ask you one question, Mark?
Oh, you can try.
So in the United States, from day one of the ADA, we've been grappling with the low employment rate of people with disabilities, and even today it hasn't changed markedly.
Sure.
It went up after ADA.
What's that?
It went up after ADA.
It went up, but it's still pretty low and pretty stagnant. Are we going to see some movement towards solution of that problem in our lifetime, or are these guys going to begin to address that problem in a different way? You can take that after the break, but
Yeah, we'll take it after the break, but you would see, what you would see is enormous disparities between different national economies, even within the so-called single market of the European Union. Call it a single market from regulatory points of view, but very different political economies, from sort of managed economies to very neoliberal economies, and the differentials between disabled people and non-disabled people's access to employment, goods and services still varies enormously between those different countries, even with this so-called single market. And that's why I'm interested to know, why are there those differences, within a single market? What incentives do we have at our disposal? What carrots, what sticks? So kind of think about that over tea.
you all passed your oral examination.
Good.
Hey.
Yeah, excellent. Good.
Can I ask a question to bring up the other side of the equation? It's particularly relevant in Ireland lately, and it's about how questionnaires designed by computers, which you see more and more of now. At least it's a sense I have, your eligibility for a particular thing being decided by a computer, and therefore the form which you fill out to give the information about yourself tends to be very, very much yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And disability, as we know, doesn't work like that. There's a lot of ambiguity in there. I mean, the whole medical kind of thing in Ireland is a whole case in point about that. It was yes, no, yes, no. There was no room for any kind of left at all for the computer to decide or not decide. How is that going to play out? In other words, forms designed by computer to decide your eligibility, they tend to be questions answered by a yes or a no, yes, no. Tick this box or don't tick this box. And it's very frustrating that without those functions, you know that to explain it, how they, a grey area in an answer or something like that. It might well change the balance of the eligibility for a given service or whatever. How is that to be addressed? Because I think that's a really live problem.
It's a long answer to which we can engage with later. Of course, forms aren't designed by computer; they're designed by people who put them on computers. Interestingly, the trend is actually slightly the other way. That in terms of eligibility, we've seen during the austerity period a tendency to try and limit the eligibility of people to benefits. It's about trying to reduce that eligibility. It's very deliberate. It's a strategy. Certainly in the UK, to save a very specific number of millions of pounds from the welfare budget. That's why they've redesigned the assessment. But interesting, the assessment is tell us your story, and it's face to face or over the phone. So it's about professional judgment. And it would be interesting to know, just to bring it back to these guys, whether within product design, whether it's within hiring and firing, within these private companies as well as public services, how much of this is about discretion, how much is it about mandatory requirements, what are the mechanisms that go on? But I'll chat to you over tea about the trend, if you like.
We will see in our lifetime, though, and we're seeing it already, much more natural language, so-called natural language processing on the web, and the so-called semantic web, which will combine the search capabilities with artificial intelligence. And the better systems, and Anthony and Robert and others can speak to that, will increasingly move in that direction. If they want to not provide benefits, then there are ways they can do it, unfortunately.
So I'm going to overrule on time for tea. So we'll take, is it 15 minutes, is that right? 15 minutes.
Thank you, guys.
Well done,